Alan, it's fantastic to have you on the podcast. I'm really excited. I mean, we haven't really had anyone on yet around the topic of insulin specifically, but I think there's so much to cover in there. And I think your background and your experience, I think there's probably not too many people around the traps who could speak to insulin and its kind of background and where it's going and some of the pharmaco elements of insulin. So I'm really excited to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining us. You're a pharmacist consultant. I know that you mentioned earlier that you started working in pharmacy when you were 14 years old. So do you want to fill in the gaps there and tell us a little bit about your experience?
I started out working in a rural pharmacy when I had just turned 14 years old, and I learned the basics of basically learned how to roll pills and make medication powder packets and mix suppositories and everything else from scratch. I mean, the pharmacists I started working with got their degrees in the 20s and did weeds and seed stuff. But we had insulin available as NPH and regular, and it was either pork or cattle, beef insulin. And it's come a long way since then. And one of my high school teachers was diabetic, and he was told when he was first diagnosed in his late teens that he probably wouldn't live past 30. And he lived to be almost 80. And it was a very influential educator for my learning process when he taught physics and some other science classes. So he was a really cool guy. So that's how I got exposed to diabetes and the issues involving and the resistance people developed to the animal insulins, because they're not exactly like humans. Then as I progressed in my career, human insulin came available. It's like, oh, wow, cool. We got a great opportunity to work with human insulin. It's a real thing. And it had some challenges too, we didn't quite expect. So I worked in a hospital for 10 years and got to see how transitioning people from animal insulin to human insulin worked. Yeah. And then I got involved in some clinical studies where I looked at testing people's blood sugars with blood glucose monitor that also checked fructosamine, and ran some stuff through on that, and it's pretty good, interesting work, published that information. And then that was kind of put the insulin community, or not the insulin community, but the monitoring community on edge, that I was changing the way things could be done. But that moved on into where I managed a bunch of pharmacies in the Kansas City area and expanded my knowledge of that and how insulin was progressing into the newer, faster acting ones. Then got involved with NIH and did some investigational review work and development of drug molecules for neurology and pain management, which are also issues with diabetes. And then I moved on into managing formularies for a state Medicaid program, and now I'm a consultant. So I've been around the block a few times. I have 20 publications in medical peer-reviewed journals that are on insulin.
So what attracted you to insulin? Like, what was it from, I don't know, at what point from a 14-year-old, at what point was your first sort of like engagement with insulin, and kind of, is it just serendipitous? I suppose it is in many people's careers, how you end up where you end up. There's a bit of serendipity involved.
It was the interest became focal point when I was a senior in high school and got to know my high school professor or teacher, and he discussed how his diabetes had been a death sentence, but it wasn't anymore. And so, okay, that's cool. We're actually saving someone's life and giving them a normal lifespan. But then we were seeing people becoming resistant to insulin when they had beef insulin, and some people did pretty well on it, but then they got resistant to it. We switched them to pork because it was closer to human. But they get resistant to that. And then we had a chance to get into human insulin, and you'd see how people struggled to manage their blood sugars. And that was a challenge. And at that time, we did urine testing, which is basically a wild guess, a slightly educated guess at what your sugar is doing. And it's like, there's a challenge here, and there's a science to it. And what do we not understand about insulin? We think we know all we know about it, but we know it's a hormone. And now that we have a human equivalent, and now we're modifying that human equivalent, because it's not pure human anymore. It's a modified human insulin for the fast acting and the long acting. So we're playing with a hormone that we think we know, but we maybe not know it as well as we think we do. And that's my concern is yeah, it manages diabetes. I mean, it manages your insulin and sugars very well, but that's not the only thing it does. It's got to have, any hormone's going to have a feedback mechanism and other influences within the body's system, because we're a homogeneous system, and anything that breaks that balance or alters that balance requires a counterbalance somewhere else. Otherwise, it would get out of kilter and our pH is off or our respirations change. Something happens to keep us from functioning properly. And insulin is critical for that. And I just think there's some other things that we don't know about it. Plus, there's some issues with potentially storage of it. Is it always as potent each dose we give our patients, and tell them to take 3 units or 4 units of fast acting insulin, and it's going to give you so many calories coverage? Well, it's a range of calories it covers, and there's a lot of things that could interfere with that. And if you don't have a quick enough absorption of it, or it absorbs too fast, that affects how your blood sugar responds. So there's a lot of science that you got to keep in mind, which that's cool to me. I get a kick out of looking into that and trying to figure out why it did that, or how come it's so good, and why does it not work right sometimes, and why do people crash, and it's hard to give, and it's a whole lifestyle change. It's a tremendous burden on the person to manage that.
It is a fascinating subject, and I think because insulin's been around for so long, it kind of it's still topical, right, in many ways. But I think that, like, what's not really being discussed that much out there in outside of the scientific realms, is what's happening with insulin. Just to kind of go back a little bit though. So if I heard correctly, you had a high school teacher who was a diabetic, and that's where you initially got interested in insulin.
And by working in the pharmacy, I actually, and that's where he came to get his medications.
Okay, so you're at high school and you're in the pharmacy. And
I worked in a pharmacy.
And your teacher had diabetes.
Yeah, it's a small town, and everybody knows each other. I mean, it's the physician that I went to was my grandfather's best friend, and he delivered me. And he didn't deliver my dad, but anyway, I graduated from high school that my grandparents graduated from. It's a small rural area, but if you're interested, everybody pitches together, and it takes a village to take care of everybody. And the diabetes community is really a village. We have to learn from each other, and no two people are the same, and we can't. And that's the practice of medicine is really a practice. It's not an exact science, because nobody is exactly the same. So we have to make general assumptions and then work outward from there, and make it work for the individual.
That's cool. And it's also, it's also cool that there are people out there like you who have taken an interest in such a specialized area, because it's that kind of specialization that pushes ahead the science and pushes ahead the technology in improving these drugs or whatever it is that we're talking about in the healthcare setting. So that's super cool. You also touched on something that I find quite interesting, right? The way you sort of described our lack of understanding of insulin and the role of hormones, and the fact that there's still stuff for us to learn about insulin and the impacts that it has on the systems that it works within, actually reminded me a little bit of just the diagnosis of diabetes, right? I know, I'd say, well, I don't know what percentage. I'd say the vast majority of people with type 1 diabetes probably can't, with any certainty, pin down why they got diabetes, right? And it's because there's a multitude of factors, and it's a chemical cascade in many senses, and there's multiple things that can trigger it. And I think that there's sort of an overlap or a relationship there in, areas for improvement of understanding in the medical community of, one, why do we get diabetes? And I know we're working on that. And as you mentioned earlier, like, why don't we know everything about insulin? What are the gaps, and what are the areas we need to understand more on?
And the interesting thing about diabetes is we've learned more about autoimmune diseases, and we know that type 1 patients have almost no beta cell function. And if you would transplant beta cells into those patients, quite often their bodies attack the new beta cells and kill them off too. It's an autoimmune system, and there's a potential for us to, if we knew what to test for from an autoimmune standpoint,
Yeah.
and what markers may be there that indicate somebody is now at risk for having type 1 diabetes early on, because quite often they're 3 or 4 years old when they show up with this, if they got some sort of a genetic or a trigger that's happened, such as a virus triggers their autoimmune response and they're attacking the beta cells. If you catch it early enough, maybe we can delay the death of the beta cell where the insulin is produced. And other people are a little older. I think you mentioned you didn't become type 1 until you were almost 30. That's pretty late for type 1. But again, we're finding that people might have a viral illness. We don't know whether COVID might increase the risk of diabetes yet, because it's a virus, and it causes a lot of really weird autoimmune issues for the long COVID symptoms that we're seeing. At least we're assuming it's causing that. So that's a concern too. Are we going to see more type 1 patients people develop type 1 diabetes in the future because of the COVID outbreak? So there's all kinds of, whoa, wow, this is getting out of hand. So if you can test for it early enough, there's a potential that you could use some sort of biologic to prevent the autoimmune response and maybe protect the beta cells. So they're researching that, and that's a cool idea, but we're still many years from being able to do that. And again, when do you test somebody? I mean, you would test every kid if they've got these immune system issues that could cause a problem. You test everybody who's a family history of diabetes to see them. There's no really ifs, ands, or whats, and we don't know what to do yet. But that's the very first part of developing diabetes. And forgive me if I'm rambling along.
No,
but then that's but again, it's the insulin is the key part. And if you can, and then one thought was if you introduce insulin earlier, you might protect some of the beta cells, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So we have human insulin, and it's rapid acting, and we now think we're smart enough that we've got an artificial pancreas. Okay. The rapid acting insulins that we've developed aren't exactly a match to human insulin. They're modified. So we're playing with the structure of insulin to make it quicker acting. I'm assuming that that's perfectly safe for long-term use and no issues will be found. But will you develop quicker resistance to that? Probably not, but we don't know, because we're still at a 20-year experiment. We don't know for sure until 20 or 30 years down the road. Then you have long-acting insulin given to you at bedtime. And then we have the pumps that monitor it, and you got continuous monitoring systems. We're trying to make a person work on artificial intelligence and a pancreas that's attached to your body. Well, that's a pain in itself. and the technology has to work together. So again, do we understand insulin, and now we're modifying it? Do we understand it and what it could do? Does it impact other areas of the body? We know that insulin is a stimulant for tumor generation and growth. It changes fat distribution. It modifies your glucose and glycogen. We now have liquid glycogen that can be added to the system that gives you a glucagon rescue. So you've got rather than like a glucagon, I'm using the wrong term, but glucagon rescue, and that's a really cool deal. That makes it more like a real artificial pancreas that you currently don't have working in your body. But again, it's got to be a system, and those systems are expensive. And we're assuming that it's going to give you a better control over a long period of time with fewer side effects. But some of the newer insulins are a little more irritating to the skin tissue. So does that, I mean, there's a lot of things we don't know yet. And again, is there an impact of what insulin does to other parts of the body? Does it, type 3 diabetes was one time used to define Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's referred to as type 3 diabetes because there is a risk of Alzheimer's and dementia in people with diabetes. So is insulin involved with that process? We don't know. So there's a lot of, the more you scratch the top of it, we figure out we don't know, and where does its impact? So that's kind of what keeps my my curiosity going, and I have a history of asking questions that people don't want to answer. And if I don't get an answer, I start digging for my own, and sometimes I don't like that either. So
that's right. That's great. Like I think the medical community needs a lot more of that. I think sometimes in the medical community, it is easy to kind of get in your groove and kind of not
If it's
rock the boat
working,
too
don't
much.
fix it, But
Yeah, I think and that's, I think there's lots of change coming in the medical community, whether they or we like it or not. I'm keen to go back a little bit. You kind of touched on the progression of insulin from porcine, bovine to human, and now kind of more novel human styles. Can you talk us through a little bit of that evolution of insulin to where it's come from and where it's at and where it's going?
Well, and it's really a cool, from a scientific standpoint, evolution is, well, they stumbled on how it works and extracted from animal pancreases this insulin that helped. Oh, that's great. But then when you use animal insulin, even though if it's really pure, your body, it's not the same as what your body's used to seeing, and you tend to get antibodies to it and become resistant to it. So the human insulin was hoped to be the panacea that solve all that. Well, it did. But again, we still see some resistance, but is that because the people are not following their diet plan? Because we are actually seeing type 1 patients develop type 2 symptoms where they're becoming resistant to insulin, even though we're using human insulin. So there's some other biochemical or genetic or personal habit issues, lifestyle issues that can maybe be causing this, and we haven't got our finger quite on it. So now we've come to the next phase of, okay, we know that the regular insulin that's human match and the NPH and the that we had that was a human match with protamine added to it to make it long acting. As far as our body was concerned, scientifically, it's a perfect match, but we weren't getting the exact response we expected to see from the human pancreas. Your body's much faster in responding to glucose intake. I mean, as soon as you start chewing food, your pancreas starts releasing insulin in anticipation of the calories. And it's a very complicated and complex biofeedback system that is working at supercomputer speed automatically. It just works because it's part of our body. So now we're trying to duplicate that in science and artificially. Well, that's not quite quick enough. We need a quicker acting insulin to mimic the insulin response you'd see from the pancreas. So we've modified the insulin and we're getting a faster response. Good. Is it perfect? No. And then again, where you inject the insulin, even the rapid acting insulins, there's some variance in people on how they respond to the dose, and it can be a whole myriad of factors. And I've asked some questions about that and upset some people because I'm not convinced I'm convinced the patients are doing the right thing most of the time. It's not the patient's fault that they had an insulin reaction. Something has to be going on with either the insulin absorption or distribution, or maybe the quality of the insulin at the time it was injected. It could have been too hot, too cold. If you get insulin too cold, it sticks together and may not disassociate in your subcutaneous tissue where you gave your shot as quickly as it normally would. So you might get a slower response, or you may be getting a slow response to some of it because of that. You've been storing it nice and cold, but not frozen, but it's been a little bit too cold maybe, and you're using it a little too cold, and you happen to use it later and it's been warmed up and maybe disassociated, or it's not sticky as much, and you get a faster response. And then you don't respond as you expect, and you tend to get an unexpected low. And that's where the danger comes for the patient. So the more we play with it, the more we find out we still don't quite understand everything. Something doesn't add up.
Is it difficult to control for these reactions from a clinical trial perspective? Like, is it difficult to separate the patient outcomes or the patient adverse events in a way where we can be more certain that those adverse events are related to a specific insulin versus a control group? Is that type of robustness existing around clinical trials?
when they do experiments on insulin response to make sure that units of insulin are given the expected response in an individual person, use what's called a glucose clamp, and they can give you a measured amount of glucose through an IV solution and a measured amount of insulin, and then you check and see how fast it drops and where your blood sugar ends up. So that's how the basic tests are done. And we do in larger clinical trials. You have so many variances between people that you just look for averages and adverse reactions. And in controlled trials where people are monitoring you really closely, and you're being really careful.
When you say controlled trials, are we talking placebos? Is there a placebo for insulin? Can you inject someone with something that's a placebo? And
if you're doing it in healthy subjects without diabetes and using a glucose clamp to see the response, you can use a placebo. But if you're dealing with people with diabetes, you don't want to use a placebo with diabetes because you're going to hurt them.
Well, that's true, but it's just hard to pin down like the adverse events and the origins if we're not, because people are having reactions random to whatever type of environmental situation all the time, right? Like our immune systems are weird and wonderful things, and like, the change of wind can trigger for someone. So that kind of stuff, I imagine controlling in trials is really the only way to kind of figure out if adverse events are really
and that's what they do. The post-marketing follow-up, and they monitor for unusual reactions that are reported back up to the FDA. That's really what you have to do. And it takes months and if not years to get enough data to say that, hey, this really A and B adds up to C most of the time, but sometimes you jump all the way to E and we don't know why. And it takes a long time to figure out what step gets screwed up in that. And again, it could be a patient error, and that happens. And it could be a storage of the insulin issue, that happens. And that can occur from anywhere from the time it's manufactured and standardized, and it gets shipped cold pack to the pharmacy and kept cold, and shipped to the patient and kept cold. Too cold, you don't want to freeze it because that messes it up, and it's possible it could be partially frozen, but we don't know. There's no way to know that with the systems we have today. And there's been individuals like yourself that have tried to go out and find a way to measure the temperature changes linearly from the minute it leaves the wholesaler to the fact that the patient delivers it to themselves. And that creates variability too. We just don't know. So there's a lot of different things people are trying to do to get their arms around why we don't have a better standardized system for everybody to use, and a reliable one unit gives me this many calorie coverage every time. It doesn't always.
You touched on storage there. This is a topic I'm particularly interested in, and I think that there's quite a bit of misinformation out there about the realities of insulin and temperature. What are the realities in terms of, we pick our insulin up from a pharmacy, and then we assume it's been looked after, right? Let's assume it's been completely looked after. We take it home, we put it in the fridge. It's protected in the fridge, so we assume it's still okay. We get it out of the fridge to use it, our long acting or our short acting, and then you have this. The manufacturers say 30 days out of the fridge. Mine, for example, will sit out of the fridge for 2 months because I don't have to. My requirements are fairly low, but I start to wonder. I start to wonder after maybe 2 months or whatever. I go, well, first of all, where does the 30 days come from, and how? I mean, and I get that pharmaceutical companies have to set a somewhat arbitrary line based on some data, which I would assume is like out of date milk, right? Where it's most common, you can use the milk for 3 or 4 or 5, depending on how risky you are and how much you
used by date is
exactly.
kind of a
best before.
You take chances after that. 4 or 5 days, you might be okay. 8 or 10 days, maybe not. And again, it depends on how it's been stored as well. And to do a study on stability, the manufacturer has a very controlled system in which they put it in a managed temperature area, which can be at refrigeration temperature, it could be at room temperature, it could be 10 degrees above room temperature, but they've got vials in each area and they keep it in that area and they test it every a unit out of that. And they usually have 8 or 10 vials that they pull out and from the same lot, and they check it in different time frames. And after they open it and store it at room temperature, after about 30 days, they see enough degradation that they are concerned that it may start being less potent to a pharmaceutical concern, where you may not get the response that you expect. So to be safe, they set the date that they set, they go starting to see change at 30 days. So that's all we're going to go. The reality is it may still be 95% potent for another 30 days after that. If you've kept it in a cool, light protected area, it may stay stable longer than that. We don't know, because they really haven't looked at that far. And with the cost of insulin, I know patients that will use it until the bottle's empty. And sometimes that's 4 months. And they know that some of them are even smart enough or have figured it out that they started out and, okay, this is my units I use when it's fresh. And after I get to this point in time, I need to add another half a unit. And they just keep, and they measure it against what the glucose response is when the blood sugars, and they stretch it out because they can't afford to pay $100, $200, $300 for a vial insulin, sometimes more, depending on what it is. So, and that's a big concern in a lot of areas that don't, in the United States is very spotty in its insurance coverage. People have high deductible plans, and when they first came out with those plans, most people assumed that was medical costs, but it included pharmacy costs too. And if you had a $10,000 deductible and you walked in and a pharmacist goes to you, you haven't met your deductible yet, so your copay is $1,000 for your insulin, and then you have somebody swing a purse at you because you're the one that delivered the bad news. That just happens, and it's just the way our system is, and the United States system is not. It's not the best. We just don't have
not perfect. I mean, it's better than some. It's worse than some. We could do a whole episode on the, and I actually do find it a fascinating topic. I mean, I think the lack of efficiency in the healthcare system in the US is a shame. There's lots of room for improvement. I want to dig a little bit more into the temperature thing and the impacts of it and the viability of it. So, what I mean, I suppose it's pharmaceutical companies, pharmacists can't really comment or give guidance on anything that's outside of a license or outside of the registration, right? Because it's what the data is saying, it's what the manufacturer is saying, it's kind of like the letter of the law. The diabetes community, are well known for going out and kind of figuring things out for themselves, right? The whole looping movement. I mean, it's common and it's great. And I really love to see that type of, pushing the boundaries. But when it comes, like, how do we figure out, like, let's say, for example, it's 30 days past when I've got my insulin out of the fridge. I've been walking to work each day. Let's say it's a 20-minute walk. My insulin, my pen's in my backpack, and let's say it's 32 degrees, 33 degrees outside when I'm walking to work. It's a hot morning here in Sydney. And then I'm walking, and then I might go out for lunch and might have it in my pocket. And then I might walk home another 20 minutes, and it's, so it's been exposed to 30 plus degrees for maybe an hour or hour and a half within that day. I mean, as a user of insulin, how do you start to figure it out? Because what happens to me is it'll be the last thing that I'll figure out, right? I'll be increasing the dose, I'll be like exercising, I'll be doing all these other things to try and get the sensitivity up or get my levels down. And then at the end I go, oh, maybe my insulin's off.
Right.
And then I change insulin, and then all of a sudden everything's back to normal. So I know that I'm pretty confident that it's the insulin's fault, right? At that point.
It probably is.
So how do we, like, is this just a case of the only real approach is to follow the letter of the law, 30 days and nothing above, say, 30 degrees Celsius, that is, which is what is that, about 86 Fahrenheit, I think.
Pretty close.
Is that really the advice for diabetics, is to kind of either follow the law or realize that there will be potentially impacts Is that kind of
that answer is it depends. Because from a pharmacist standpoint, a physician standpoint, whatever the label, the FDA or the EU, if you use it, because the EU uses a little different, and they got actually some better stability information on some of them. They have longer use terms than the FDA is approved, but that's the guidelines. And that's what we have to tell you is that 30 days or 28 days or whatever the label says, you should dispose of what's left and get a fresh one. That's what you should do. We know as healthcare practitioners, and we know due to the cost and the convenience factor, and the fact that you may not have had a chance to get by the pharmacy, get a fresh bottle or a fresh pen. I mean, life happens. So you're going to keep using it. That's just human nature. I can't, as a health professional, change that. I can advise you against that. Can you do it, get away with it? You can, but I can't advise you that, because then my liability comes in, because I'm advising something outside the label. And that's where the diabetes community working together, if we can coordinate enough people, and that's where you get into controlled trials and a lot of oversight requirements to make an FDA level change. No manufacturer is going to spend the money to do that, because they've already spent the money and they're trying to make a profit, because it's expensive to do that kind of study. So groups that can put together data that shows under certain circumstances, and you see, actually, we've seen some reports from Africa and Asia where they have high temperatures regularly and poor options for cool storage, in which they are able to use insulin well past its recommended use date, and able to keep it, as long as it doesn't get too hot. They've been able to manage it and get a biological response that's within what they expect it to be. And again, that's not official data because it came as an individual study. But we're seeing a growing amount of information coming through that says that you can probably extend that lifespan of the insulin use, but you're not going to get somebody like me to tell you officially that you can do that. It happens, and you just have to be very careful. And that's where the individual has to understand their body. And again, if you're a diabetic and using insulin, you have to be almost a genius to stay on top of that stuff. I mean, it's you got to stay focused all the time. And some people are not capable of understanding everything they need to do, and their lifestyle doesn't support that type of regular routine. And if they get away with it for a while, they continue to try to do so. And we've seen patients who've tried to stretch their insulin too far and end up with diabetic ketoacidosis and die at a very young age. And it's a crime in itself that people that cannot have access to care and reliably dose themselves with medications. And a lot of them are younger folks, and they go out and party too hard. That messes them up. And I've dealt with patients that have done that. And it just, oops, I went out too much to drink, and that poor person passed away because of that. They're
That's
trying
tragedy.
to be human.
That's a tragedy. So just one assumption, and just correct me if I'm wrong. So my assumption is that from the temperature perspective and insulin, right, is that on those trips to work, on those periods where, I've got my insulin and it's outside and it's in a warm area, my assumption is that if I can just, manage to kind of keep my insulin even a few degrees, 5 degrees, 10 degrees below the external temperature, the air temperature, that I'm doing some good. Now, there probably is never going to be a trial that's robust enough to ever really give me a conclusive answer to this question. But I guess the point is, what I'm trying to do is to think about ways where I can just improve the exposure of the insulin, or just keep it lower than the air temperature as often as I can, and that's going to have some small effect. And as hard as it is to measure, it's going to have some effect.
It does. And again, it falls under the category brief excursions at certain temperatures don't
Yeah.
cause too much damage. But
Yeah.
the trick is what you determine is brief exposure
Yeah.
outside the desired temperature. And there are some people that have come up with some pretty cool coolers that hold a pen, and you can throw it in a backpack, and it helps manage the temperature without a whole lot of extra. Some run on batteries, some just are super insulated to keep your insulin within expected temperatures, maybe not refrigerated temperature, but cool enough that you're not going to have degradation in insulin. And I would recommend anybody who can afford those options to use those and work it into your routine to keep it as stable as temperature as possible. Now we do have shipping in the United States, and some mail order occurs. And when mail order first started happening with insulin, I'd have patients bring me their insulin and it would actually be frozen. And for a suspension of insulin, that messes it up completely. And they would still use it, and their blood sugars would go crazy. And because they couldn't afford it, and they wouldn't send them any new insulin because they'd already got their 3-month supply. So it was a real challenge there. And the other issue is they usually put temperature sensors in them to measure the temperature. And if it shows it's been too hot, you shouldn't accept that shipment. And that's how it's shipped to the pharmacies. They have temperature sensors in them, and then we keep them in a regularly checked. We actually keep refrigeration logs each day on our temperatures, actually twice a day, the temperature in the refrigerator, to make sure that they're within the regulated temperature range that we expect to have them. So we monitor that very closely. The human, for the average consumer, no, you don't. You throw it in your refrigerator and forget about it till you take it out in a while, and that creates a whole nother issue. So the goal is to try and keep it as stable as possible as far as the temperature goes.
Every little bit helps, really, doesn't it? Like
Absolutely.
That's kind of the summary. Like every little bit you can do to protect your insulin from like increasing temperatures is going to have an indiscernible but potentially relevant benefit to you in terms of its
and that'll help you hit your 30 days, maybe 1 or 2 over of utilization without worrying about it not working as well. But again, if you're checking your sugars regularly, if it's less insulin, it's less potent, you can adjust your insulin dose if you need to, and you're not going to get low. But if you happen to open a new vial and it's full potency, and you've been using one that's a little subpotent, and you use the same dose, then you can get in trouble real quick, particularly if you're walking in a hot day and it's hotter than normal. Your sugar is going to drop, and it can drop so quickly that you really can't recover from it without hurting yourself or somebody else.
Good stuff. That's great stuff, Alan. Actually, really good stuff. I love this stuff. It's really cool. So one of the things that I'm curious to get your take on, and I think it's a topic that you'll be familiar with, and that's kind of the political and the emotive kind of landscape, particularly in the US. I think it's not as extreme in Australia and Europe because of the way that the healthcare systems reimburse or support patients. I think that the way the model is set up in the States, has lent itself to insulin prices being for the patient being higher than in other parts of the world, and that has led to all sorts of problems. I've heard about patients, for example, sparing their insulin to a point where they've died. It's not common, but it's tragic, right? That you think that someone in a first world country, with a decent healthcare system, isn't able to access, a life necessary medication, and has to spare their insulin to save money, and that can cause, ICU admissions and death. Right. Because you've been in and around the system and around insulin for so long, I'd love to get your take on that whole scenario, really.
It's business, and business ethics and healthcare ethics don't always match. And the way our system is structured, from a Medicare Part D and other patches we put on our healthcare system to make it work, or at least seem to work, we've created incentives for price increases rather than managing they just grows faster than the rate of inflation by quite a bit.
Yeah.
And it's really set up to incentivize increases in price. As long as somebody else is paying the bill, the consumer doesn't care, as long as their copay remains what they can afford. But we also don't have an equitable society, and people don't always have the same insurance coverage. And quite often in our gig work economy we have now, a lot of people don't have insurance at all, and they're just skating naked, and they have to pay it out of pocket. And I actually had a patient years ago who was a self-employed entrepreneur, and she did very well, but she'd been diabetic since she was 8 or 9 years old. And she managed she wouldn't use the new insulin. She uses regular and NPH. She wouldn't use any of the new stuff. And she kept her A1C at 5.4 or 5.5 all the time. And because she knew how to manage her diet and exercise and her insulin dose. And she paid for everything out of pocket. And she budgeted for that. But she also, as an entrepreneur and self-employed businesswoman, she just built it right in her budget right up front. Well, she was on top of it. Most people are not. And if you don't have an employer that's got insurance, or you don't are on a Medicare or Medicaid program, being able to afford insulin and all the supplies you need. I mean, you think, oh yeah, insulin is expensive, but so are the test strips. If you use a continuous monitor, that's expensive. It's many thousands of dollars a year to manage that situation, and people just don't have the money, and they do without. And they stretch their insulin, they skip doses, anything they do to get by, and they end up in the ICU with tremendously large bills if they survive the ketoacidosis that they present with. So it's a shame. I understand that we're trying to create a cap on insulin prices from our federal government, and how that's going to work, I'm not sure, but they're going to try and cap it. But again, if it costs $20 and all you've got is $5 and you still have to buy food, can you afford to buy your insulin? No. So even at capping it, for some people, it becomes still somewhat unaffordable. But we're not going to give it to you for free in most cases, unless you're on Medicaid. And Medicaid, if you qualify for that, you would probably have at least very little cost out of your pocket. So we have a society that is haves and have-nots, and that's too bad.
It's definitely a capitalist system, and that's definitely, I think, that systemic element is definitely what is the driver to, it's a numbers thing, right? It's just a case of the number of people that can't access insulin at an affordable price. I think in Australia, for example, there might still, there's a small cost to us when we go to the pharmacy to get it, but otherwise the government, reimburses the majority of it, right? And most of our supplies as well. And I think same in the UK and probably, several Northern European countries as well. And so there's an example of where, the problems, there really isn't too many problems here with access to insulin, regardless of your income level. So it really does come down to that kind of, as you say, the haves and have-nots, and the system that's at play that kind of creates the gap and means that some people can afford it and they can afford it quite easily, and some people, well, many people can't really afford it at all. To put you on the spot a little bit, what's the solution in the US to make it more accessible?
And speaking from somebody who's never been a fan of cradle to grave healthcare costs, because it's just a huge expense. You have to get the person to buy into managing their health. You can't just say, I'm going to take care of you, and then just not do what you want to do, everything you want to do, and not take care of yourself. There's a personal responsibility there. But potentially we need some kind of, particularly in diabetes, some kind of system that if you're insulin dependent diabetic, that the government or some altruistic payer picks up 90% of the costs or 100% of the costs for everybody, and just make it equitable across the board. Now, the other side of the coin of that is in order to be healthy, you can be diabetic, and if you're not eating the right foods at the right time, just because you're using insulin doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be healthy. And so there's an issue is if food gets too expensive, and I've run into this situation too, people are buying high processed foods because it's cheaper, but it high sodium and it's high fat. And then they end up with insulin resistance because they're overweight and because they're not eating the right balance of foods. So there's that part of it as well. So we can make sure everybody's got access to the right medication and using it appropriately. But if they're not following through with the rest of the management process for diabetes, then they can still run into trouble. And affordability of food is another issue, which we're starting to see that increase.
Oh God, I just read a report this morning about, I mean, I think we're heading into some pretty scary territory when it comes to the price of commodities and food in particular. And, you know, the conflict around Russia and Ukraine at the moment is a big part of that. And that's actually pretty scary. And I don't think actually we understand as a society the risk and actually what it's going to mean, like for the cost of living and just access. Like things are about to change, I think, from a consumption point of view in the next few years. That's going to be uncomfortable.
I agree. We have some tremendous challenges from a food resource and a water resource position that we don't yet understand how we're going to deal with. And again, we need quality protein for people, and we also need some carbohydrates to balance it out. And those are expensive to create and maintain. And we've just about tapped out what we can grow and raise on our farming areas. And being an old farm boy, I understand where everything comes from and how it gets to your table from the hoof to the plate and from the grain field to the cereal bowl. I've been involved with that all my life. So it's a scary thing to realize that we're losing access to that much grain production that interfaces with good nutrition throughout the world. And it'll hit the smaller and weaker countries harder than it does us, but it's still going to hit us too. I mean, it's going to get expensive. And again, that becomes, how do you manage your diabetes best when the normal foods that you've been buying suddenly become outside your budget and you have to go to cheaper alternatives or not eat as, and again,
it's going to be a lot more backyard gardens, I think.
Exactly.
We're opening multiple cans of worms here, which we could probably spend an hour each on all of them. I want to ask just one more question before we wrap up, and it's putting you on the spot again slightly. It's a question I've had for a while. I'm really curious about this one. How long, on average, can a type 1 diabetic live without insulin? And I know there's going to be, I know before insulin existed, diet was the control, right? And so I think we could probably look back at that. And, I think people were able to live up to a year or so with really strict diet control. Is there a kind of consensus that exists with a question like that at the moment?
I don't know that there's an exact answer for that, because some diabetics have some beta cell function. And they can manage their diabetes with a very micro diet and keep their blood sugar low. But are they taking enough calories in that they're not losing muscle mass? And starvation diet cures some things, but it also kills you too. So it's a question that how long can you survive? If you're a typical average diabetes patient, no pancreatic function at all, and you don't use any insulin, and you eat a normal meal, you could be, again, it depends on the individual, you could be ketoacidotic in a week or less. So it's, and it depends on what you've had to eat and drink too. But I've dealt with patients that pretty much did that. We get them stabilized in the hospital setting, and very, very nice people, but they had alcohol problems and young, and they go out and they get to drink, and they would use their insulin, and it would take them about a week to end up back in the hospital emergency room, because they didn't, once they left, and they'd be given insulin when they left, but they would never give themselves a shot outside the hospital system. They'd come back in about a week, 10 days in a ketoacidotic coma, and we'd have to revive them. And it was a monthly cycle. It would just they come in, we treat them for a week or so, and then go out, and another week or so they come back in, and it was a sad case. And of course, when in that cycle, eventually it becomes, if you either fix it yourself or you die, and that's
yeah. Look, there's probably only one way to really answer that question, and it's probably a way that's really not going to be a fun way to have an answer.
And from a provider standpoint, when you meet some wonderful people that have a terrible disease, and diabetes is a terrible disease. Diabetes and cancer are probably the two, and Alzheimer's is probably three worst diseases you can deal with, because they happen to the best people, and you try and help them, and sometimes things are just out of your control, and you can't get them. You can't save them, and once you get to know somebody and really even as a practitioner, you get to know them, and you're not really friends with them, but you understand them. Sometimes you know their family and their kids and their grandkids, and when they pass, it hurts a little. It really does, and you just hate to see that. And what could I have done differently? How could I help them better? All that runs through your head, and if you're a compassionate person, it does kind of weigh on you after a while. And that's the reason I got ticked off at diabetes. I mean, I just got pissed because I couldn't see my type 2 patients getting any better, and why not? And they go on insulin, and it got even worse. What are we doing wrong? And then of course, type 1s, as in a general rule, if they get access to care, do fine, other than it's a burden on them to make sure that they take care of their bodies and do their insulin doses and their families. And for parents of young children who are diabetic, it's a nightmare. I mean, they can't go to sleep and have a decent night's sleep for years because they're worried about their child having a low glucose or insulin reaction. So it's scary, and it's wears and tears on families and people. So I'd like to see us do better.
It's an absolute, look, I 100% agree with you on that. You know what, and it's an absolute pleasure to talk to you. It's an absolute pleasure to kind of see your enthusiasm for insulin, for the diabetes community, and like I really appreciate you sharing the insight that you've gained over your career. I just want to thank you very much for giving us time today.
Well, thank you for listening to my ramblings and explanations of things.
Pleasure.
Hopefully, I've helped you and your audience understand a little bit more about what we face, and reach out anytime. I'm happy to answer any questions or help anybody along this line. I'd like to stay in contact with you.
Thanks, Alan.